Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Exorcist, starring Ellen Burstyn, Linda Blair, Jason Miller, Max von Sydow, Lee J. Cobb, Kitty Wynn, and Jack McGowran. Forgive me if I said that wrong. Directed by the late William Friedkin, who just passed away recently. May he rest in peace. So, there's a new Exorcist coming that doesn't feature Linda Blair but Ellen Burstyn. But I have met recently Linda Blair for the first time. Here's a photo. Wait, let me get this a little closely. Here's a photo between me and Linda right here. And after I got that later in the day, I got my Exorcist Blu-ray signed that says "To Scott, Sweet Dreams from Linda Blair," pretty much. And I have seen this movie before, where I first saw this movie. I think when I was in college, if memory serves me right. I forget, but I watched it on Netflix one day, not on disc, but like on a streaming device on Netflix. So, what do I think of it then? Well, let's see if it's as good as I remember it. Let's get into it. We open in the director's cut at the house, which I didn't get the point of that. Whereas in the theatrical, we open in northern Iraq, which is the second scene in the director's cut. But, anyways, we're in northern Iraq where we see Father Lancaster Marin, played by Max von Sydow, digging up for a rare fossil as he's an older man and shakes quite a bit while eating at a restaurant and sees three men working on iron steel. And Father Marin leaves the Church of Iraq and he sees something demonic on a statue band. Excuse me. Statue that hand, or something of the devil, while we see dogs fight. And the score sounds like something scary is about to happen. And besides that scene, I was just talking about what was the point of the restaurant scene in northern Iraq? As that could have been cut down from the movie. And some of the scenes in Iraq did take too long, and besides the statue scene, there was nothing that too frightening about this opening scene, in my opinion. We move on to Georgetown, and we see an actress named Chris O'Neill, played by Ellen Burstyn, writing some things, and we see her filming a scene for a movie she's working on, which is something I don't remember from the movie when I first saw it. And I've seen this movie a few times in my life, and this is like my fourth or fifth viewing for the show. Meanwhile, I've been meaning to go back to it, but I haven't gotten a chance until recently. Meanwhile, we follow Damien Carras, played by Jason Miller, who's a Catholic priest, as Chris walks home, and as she gets there, she's greeted by her 12-year-old daughter Reagan, played by the horror icon Linda Blair, thanks to this movie. And I'll get to why later in the show. And I really like these characters so far this movie isn't frightening as it will get there later in the movie. But first we have to know these characters before any demonic thing happens in this movie. As I'm giving it a little bit of time, say around 35 minutes into the movie, as Damien visits her mother. And I swear to God, because his name was Damien in this movie, I was thinking of the demon child from The Omen, which will come out maybe 5 years later, and I like that this is the original horror exorcism movie because Lord knows they're not original after this movie anymore. So as far as I'm concerned, Chris finds a Ouija board on in Reagan's stuff, and they play with it, which I guess is the first scary scene because Ouija boards lead to something scary happening, which will hopefully happen later in the movie. A phone call wakes up Chris while Reagan can't sleep because she hears noises in the attic, and Chris goes in the attic at night, which is a bad idea in my opinion because it scares the living hell out of me. As she brings a candle up, and while looking around, the candle turned into a flame, which was scary as hell. The next day comes and a priest brings flowers to the church while one of the statues was vandalized by something demonic or kids. But because this movie is called The Exorcist, it's something demonic, I'm guessing. But that doesn't really scare me as much as the previous scene I brought up a few seconds ago. While Damien goes to the mental hospital and sees his mother there, and she doesn't want to see him, and he asks someone to move her in a different hospital, which is a pretty sad scene. And I don't expect sad from a horror movie. Chris has a party at her house, and a drunk asshole who bothers an old man to get on people's nerves and drinks some more, and he gets kicked out. And this is when the movie starts to kick into gear, and when people started to get scared versus going to the bathroom to vomit versus can't go back in the theater because of how frightening it is. Reagan wakes up and says something demonic with a demonic voice and pees on the floor, as Chris is leading to believe something is really wrong with Reagan, as her bed moves around like by the demon, like out of control, which is frightening as Reagan starts calling people like priests and doctors fucking bastards, which is not like Reagan from when we first met her in the movie. And that's the demon talking, and that is also very fucking frightening, which is something horror movies from A24 or any other horror movies out there I have problems with. And that is they unfortunately don't scare me as much as this movie does. And this is from the 1970s, for Christ's sakes, from Warner Brothers. A doctor puts a needle to poke on Reagan's neck as it bleeds all over the place, and I had to look away as that kind of thing actually scares the shit out of me, as Reagan has made x-rays from the doctors, including Dr. Klein, as he comes to the house, and another doctor, and Reagan is moving like a demon and smacks the doctor around and says, "Fuck me," and I'm thinking to myself, what the fuck is that? Is fucking horrifying. And that's when we learn she's possessed by a demon, and Chris is absolutely worried about Reagan, as would I if I were a parent. And that's how super effective this movie really is. And that's why people are afraid to go back inside the movie theater back in the 1970s, as it scares the living hell out of people. Now, granted, I wasn't alive when this movie came out in theaters back in the 1970s, and it's shot very well done by director William Friedkin, who just recently passed away. Again, may he rest in peace, as he does a fantastic job at making this movie look frightening as hell. While Reagan sees a doctor and bites him in the crotch and bites her own mother, as this is the scariest movie of all time. Jesus. The doctors say they don't have a choice but to put her away, as they can't do anything for her, while Chris is talking with the doctors about exorcism, while a priest comes into the house to talk Chris about getting Reagan exercised, and they have a pretty good written dialogue, as the movie won an Oscar for Best Writing as an adaptation, as this was a book before it was ever a movie. And after he leaves, Reagan throws everything around and stabs herself and says, "Jesus, fuck you," or whatever that was, which sounds like a fucking demon would say, and slaps Chris around to the ground and acts all demonic and shit, which frightened me, as what kind of little girl is that, as she's possessed by a demon. But the sound design really makes these scenes sound super real. Next scene comes and Chris meets with Damien, and they walk and talk about the exorcism, and he agrees to help them as he comes into the house and Reagan's room, and she looks awful, and some green goo and spits with some green goo on her, as Damien introduces herself, while the demon introduces himself as the devil, and vomits more green goo in Damien, which is something I believe people got sick in the theater from that scene, if I'm not mistaken, as it frightens everyone, even me. Damien records every word the demon says, that even in Latin, as he sprays holy water on the demon, and tells Chris he'll analyze the tape, as he really listens to the tape again and again, along with another priest. And these scenes do work in order to do the exorcism. Damien comes into Reagan's bedroom, and it's super cold in there, as the real Reagan writes "help me" on the skin and asks the president priest, let's call him, to do the exorcism himself. And he also sends Father Merrin. Remember him from the beginning of the movie? Well, he comes back for his one last exorcism, and I'll get there in a few minutes on why. And we get to nighttime and see the iconic image that was on the poster of Father Merrin facing the house, as he comes in and helps out Damien, and they get prepared for the exorcism. And as it begins, After they step in the room, Father Merrin sprays holy water on the demon, and the demon spits on him, and he starts saying words while the demon insults them while performing the exorcism. The demon pulls the bed set up and puts it down while the demon screams for its life and starts to laugh as Father Merrin casts the demon out while he tries to kill the two priests. And the body lifts up, and that's frightening as hell, as Father Merrin and Damien says repeatedly, the power of Christ compels you. And the demon beats up Damien briefly, and the demon tries to kill Father Merrin, but they take a brief break as they go back to the room, and Damien hears his mother's voice while Father Merrin advises him to leave the room as he continues the exorcism. And Damien comes back in the room and sees that Father Merrin is suddenly dead. And how is that possible? It was off screen, so I couldn't really tell you. The demon must have killed it, as Damien beats the demon up and says, "Take me," as Reagan becomes normal again, while Damien becomes the demon and kills himself as the cops and the paramedics come in. And the next day comes as Chris and Reagan move out of the house and never have to look back, as the climax was the scariest movie of the movie, and it proves this is the scariest movie of all time, and it earns it for a damn good reason. Now it's time for my rating. I'll give this movie a 8.7 out of 10. Even though I had some critical things to say at the beginning, like around the first 35 minutes of the movie, I went with the movie as it is as I gave it the setup before any of the exorcism ever happens in this movie. And I really do like the characters in this movie, and Linda Blair is the horror icon she is today thanks to this movie, as she was perfect casting as far as I'm concerned. This movie is frightening and horrifying at the same time, as I get why this movie is called the scariest movie of all time. In my opinion, even more scarier than anything A24 movies gives me, as those movies don't scare me as much as this is the movie everyone back in the 1970s ran out of the theater as they were afraid to go back inside the auditorium because it was that scary. And it's shot very well done by director William Friedkin, who died very recently. May he rest in peace. But he does a fantastic job making this movie look frightening as hell. The scariest movie of all time, as you have to believe the hype of you're a big horror fan, as the scares did frighten the hell out of me, and it's very well done. And this is a solid recommendation if you wish to get scared by a horror film. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with The Exorcist 2, The Heretic, or whatever the hell that thing's called. And until then, let's exorcise the demon.